Never again. No reruns, no listings, no explanations.
For 3 decades, Johnny Carson wasn't just a late-night host. He was late night. Millions of Americans tuned in nightly to watch him laugh, banter, and share a stage with the biggest celebrities on earth. But what we saw on television wasn't the whole story. Behind the curtain, Johnny carried a list, not of favorite guests, but of those he considered some of the darkest people in Hollywood. According to those who worked closest with him, Carson's charming smile hid a sharp eye for cruelty. And when the cameras turned off, he sometimes leaned over to his sidekick Ed McMahon and whispered, "That person should never be around a camera or a child." This wasn't about divas demanding sparkling water or high-end snacks. Carson's quiet blacklist named stars he believed were truly toxic human beings. People whose behavior in private didn't match the polished image they showed America. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on those shocking stories, starting with a Hollywood queen whose glamorous veneer hid an icy cruelty that stunned even Carson himself. Our first name on Carson's Never Again list was none other than Hollywood royalty Joan Crawford. On screen and under the studio lights, Crawford appeared elegant, graceful, and soft-spoken, the embodiment of old Hollywood's golden glow. But according to Carson and his staff, the moment she stepped off that shining stage, her true nature revealed itself. Sharp, unkind, and calculating. Production staff recall receiving an alarming memo days before her appearance. 4 pages of instructions dictated everything from the exact angle of Carson's desk, to how far the chair should recline, to the studio's air temperature set at exactly 67 degrees. One veteran crew member joked that Crawford didn't want to be interviewed, she wanted to run NASA. Still, they played along. This was Joan Crawford, after all. But when taping day came, things spiraled almost immediately. Crawford arrived 3 hours early, flanked by her personal entourage, including her own makeup team. The Tonight Show had Emmy-winning makeup artists, but she refused to let them touch her face. Fine, again, manageable. But the atmosphere changed when she began interacting with the crew. A young, nervous production assistant, just 20 years old and new to the industry, knocked softly on her dressing room door, holding a glass of water Crawford had requested. The girl entered, smiling nervously when Crawford turned and unleashed a verbal attack so scathing that staff members in the hall froze. Witnesses said Crawford's cruelty was chilling. She mocked the assistant's appearance, insulted her intelligence, and with a venom that left the girl in tears, suggested she was better suited for street work than show business. Crawford then demanded the assistant be fired on the spot. The producers flatly refused, but that moment stained the entire taping and left Carson with a permanent impression. Off-air, he later admitted to a confidante that talking to Crawford had been like interviewing a statue, cold and empty inside. Why was this moment so significant? Because it wasn't just a tantrum. It revealed a larger truth about Hollywood of that era. Stars like Crawford built their careers not only on talent but on carefully managed illusions. What the camera captured wasn't who they truly were. For Carson, who valued wit, warmth, and humanity even in the spotlight, there was nothing worse than someone who treated people as disposable. He may have played friendly on air, but behind closed doors, Crawford's name quietly topped his unspoken do not invite list. And she wasn't alone. Sources close to Carson revealed that her story was only the tip of the iceberg. From beloved comedians to respected actors, he had encountered celebrities who treated the powerless with disdain and used fame as a shield to mask darker truths. In his later years, Carson became more open with friends about the celebrities he despised. These weren't just egos or eccentric stars. He described them as predators, abusers, and manipulators protected by an industry desperate to preserve their marketable images. One beloved actor, still remembered today as a wholesome American icon, was caught by Carson in a backstage incident so disturbing that the host nearly called the police. Another guest, celebrated for her vulnerable screen presence, berated studio staff so viciously Carson later remarked, "She should never be within a mile of a young person." Though Carson never shared this blacklist publicly, insiders recall him muttering backstage about patterns he noticed again and again. The bigger the mask, the darker the shadow behind it. So why revisit Johnny Carson's hidden blacklist now? Because the entertainment industry still struggles with the same duality. The pressure to maintain an untouchable image often disguises abuse, cruelty, and toxic behavior. Carson's quiet resistance wasn't about canceling careers. It was about using his private judgment to protect himself, his show, and his team from people he considered dangerous. The golden glow of Hollywood has always been built on illusion, And Johnny Carson, America's late-night friend, understood better than anyone that once the lights dim, the real stars show who they truly are. Carson welcomed thousands of guests over 30 years. He shook their hands, shared their laughter, and gave them a stage. But when the audience went home, the man behind the desk remembered who they really were. And for a select few, Johnny's smile was only for the cameras. If Joan Crawford represented the calculated mask of Hollywood, perfect on the surface, empty beneath, Johnny Carson's next adversary was something altogether different. This man wasn't coldly rehearsed like Crawford. He was raw force, charisma laced with intimidation. Carson described him not just as a star, but as a bully in a tuxedo. We're talking about none other than Frank Sinatra. Old blue eyes. On screen, Sinatra and Carson looked friendly enough. The crooner would flash his famous grin, toss off a snappy one-liner, maybe sing a few bars, and Carson would play along as the accommodating host. To viewers at home, it seemed like camaraderie. Two legends from different worlds sharing easy banter. But Carson's private feelings were very different. He respected Sinatra's talent, no doubt. What unsettled him wasn't the music. It was how Sinatra wielded his power when the cameras stopped rolling. Carson once confided to a friend that Sinatra reminded him of a mafia enforcer, smooth, commanding, but edged with menace. If he hadn't been a singer, Carson reportedly said, he'd have been collecting debts in an alley. And sometimes, I wasn't sure he wasn't doing both. Every Sinatra visit to The Tonight Show created immediate tension. Unlike other stars who might arrive with one assistant or agent, Frank often stormed in with an entourage of 6, 7, sometimes even 8 men. They weren't studio handlers or managers either. As one cameraman later explained, they didn't look like showbiz people. They looked like the kind of guys who follow you out of a bar when you say the wrong thing. These men would spread through the studio corridors, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crew. The vibe was unmistakable. Surveillance. Staff members described it as working under watchtowers. Carson hated this atmosphere. He thrived on making his set a place of comfort, but Sinatra's presence turned that comfort into tension. One backstage encounter cemented Carson's growing dislike. It happened during a 1970s taping. A floor manager, a seasoned professional and Korean War veteran, followed protocol by giving Sinatra the standard 3 minutes till showtime notice. But instead of acknowledging the cue, Sinatra reportedly grabbed the man by his tie, yanked him close and hissed, "Nobody tells me when I have 3 minutes. I go on when I say I'm ready." Witnesses later recalled the manager's face turning pale. The man, who had faced bullets in battle, was shaken more by Sinatra's threat than his wartime service. Carson, watching from his office monitor, was furious. For a moment, he seriously considered pulling Sinatra from the show. Only the producer's insistence that viewers and ratings demanded Sinatra kept the night on track. But Carson never forgot it. Sinatra also had a notorious reputation for unreliability. He was known to cancel his Tonight Show appearances on a whim, sometimes just hours before going live. One night, staff were preparing for his grand entrance. He was already in the building when he simply declared, "Not in the mood," and walked out. For Carson's team, it was a nightmare. Schedules had to be rewritten, backup plans scrambled. But because Sinatra meant ratings, his behavior was always tolerated. The cruelest side of Sinatra's arrogance, though, surfaced during one particular commercial break. According to crew members present, Sinatra made a cutting remark about a female staffer's looks, loud enough that half the room could hear. Johnny's usual style was to shrug off small indignities backstage, but this time was different. He turned, cold and sharp, and said directly to Sinatra, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The room went silent. Sinatra, used to getting his way unchallenged, actually looked startled. When the red light blinked back on, Carson slipped back into professionalism, but his questions for Sinatra were noticeably shorter. The warmth was gone. Carson's dislike wasn't just words. It translated into action. Normally, he stayed out of booking decisions, trusting producers to fill the chairs night after night. But after that commercial break confrontation, Carson reportedly went to his producer and said, "I don't care what his ratings are. Once a year maximum." For Carson, who rarely interfered with guest decisions, this was extraordinary. It underscored how deep his distaste ran. And while viewers at home continued to see the on-screen smiles, behind the scenes, everyone knew the truth. Carson respected Sinatra's voice, but despised the man who wielded it like a weapon. When you place Joan Crawford and Frank Sinatra side by side on Carson's private blacklist, a pattern begins to emerge. Different temperaments, different styles of cruelty, but the same underlying truth. Fame can cloak the darkest parts of personality. Crawford was cold calculation. Sinatra was charming intimidation. One froze the room with cruelty, the other filled it with fear. And Carson, night after night, had to navigate both without letting the mask of television crack. Johnny Carson built his legend on laughter, but in his private notes and conversations with friends, he also built something else, a warning record of the famous faces who revealed too much when the lights were off. 2 names down. But Carson's blacklist held more secrets, and the next may shock you even more. If Frank Sinatra embodied the bully with charm, Carson's next problem guest showed what happens when brilliance grows so large it no longer recognizes boundaries. For Carson, ego was almost harder to deal with than intimidation, and no one symbolized that outsized ego better than Orson Welles. To audiences, Welles was fascinating. His rich baritone voice, his dramatic pauses, his legendary career. He gave the world Citizen Kane. Every TV appearance turned into a performance and millions were hooked. But to Carson and his crew, Welles was a nightmare disguised as genius. From the very beginning, he made it clear that he didn't play by Tonight Show rules. Writers would spend days preparing thoughtful questions about his films, his stage work, his philosophies on art. When they showed Welles the carefully typed notes, he reportedly waved them away, struck them through with a pen, and handed back blank pages. One staffer later remarked, "It felt like he wasn't just dismissing our work, he was dismissing the entire structure of television." That left Carson standing flat-footed on live TV, forced to improvise with one of the most intimidating minds in film history. The Tonight Show was a well-oiled machine. Segments were timed down to the second. Johnny was a master at hitting beats, wrapping stories before commercial breaks, and keeping the night flowing. But none of that mattered once Welles sat down. One mid-1970s appearance was scheduled for a simple 7-minute conversation. Welles, once seated, launched into one of his sprawling operatic anecdotes about Shakespeare, about theater, about wine. No one was quite sure. He kept talking. 10 minutes passed, 15. 25 minutes later, producers were frantically waving signals from backstage. Carson gave polite cues, tapping his pencil, shifting in his seat, signals every other guest understood. Welles ignored them all. That night, 2 other guests were bumped completely from the show, and Welles left the studio without the faintest acknowledgement of the chaos he'd caused. Carson later muttered, "Genius doesn't excuse taking over another man's stage." Welles's treatment of staff only deepened Carson's disdain. He had a habit of refusing to speak directly to production assistants, even while they stood beside him. Instead, Welles would gesture vaguely and say things like, "Tell the girl to fetch more water," or "Ask the boy to move the light." This wasn't eccentric genius anymore. It was condescension. The worst came when Welles started instructing not just assistants, but the very camera crew. One evening, he interrupted his own story to point at the overhead rig and shout, "No, pan left, push in here," as though he were directing Citizen Kane all over again. But on Carson's set, a producer later explained, "That was the only time I saw Johnny truly furious during a taping." The Tonight Show wasn't anyone else's playground, and Orson was trying to turn it into his own production. Though Carson never let his irritation show during broadcasts, privately he told Ed McMahon, "Never again. If brilliance means trampling everyone else, I don't need it on my couch." Where Welles represented suffocating ego, another guest brought unpredictable hostility. She was magnetic, sharp-witted, endlessly quotable, and utterly exhausting for Carson. That guest was Bette Davis, the queen of verbal fire. On television, Davis was dazzling. When she took her seat next to Johnny, her raspy voice carried decades of Hollywood history. She told delicious behind-the-scenes stories. She sparred playfully with hosts. Audiences at home adored her. But when the red light clicked off, Carson faced someone who treated conversation like a courtroom battle. According to staff, Davis often contradicted producers outright, dismissing their time limits, bristling at scheduling reminders. If Carson gently tried to move the discussion along, she'd double down, challenging his segue or interrupting his transition. One writer recalled, "It felt less like watching her chat and more like watching her rip cross-examinations out of thin air." Carson, legendary for his composure, was left rattled. After one brutal taping, he told McMahon, "She doesn't want a stage, she wants a witness stand." What startled Carson most was Davis's tongue. She could be charmingly sharp during on-air stories, but backstage staff bore the brunt of her verbal assaults. An assistant who accidentally brought her the wrong brand of cigarettes received a withering 5-minute scolding that reduced the poor boy nearly to tears. Another time, a nervous intern offered her a cup of coffee. Davis raised the cup, sniffed it, and muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This tastes like gutter water. Someone get me something drinkable." Carson valued kindness toward his team above all else, and Davis, for all her wit and brilliance, displayed so little patience for ordinary people that Carson marked her down as one of the most unpleasant stars he ever hosted. By this point, Carson's behind-the-scenes list was becoming clearer. These weren't just eccentric icons. Crawford, Sinatra, Welles, Davis all represented something darker: calculated cruelty, bullying, unchecked ego, and weaponized words. And while America laughed along with these stars on television, Carson alone bore witness to their shadows. Joan Crawford froze the room. Frank Sinatra intimidated it. Orson Welles hijacked it, and Bette Davis turned it into a courtroom. Carson played the professional every single time, but quietly he kept the names. His mental blacklist of the powerful, the cruel, and the impossible. And the next entry, maybe the most shocking of all, a groundbreaking comedian who turned the Tonight Show green room into a place of fear. Johnny Carson once joked privately, "No one should have to be cross-examined by Bette Davis without a lawyer present." To him, Davis wasn't just difficult. She turned conversation into combat, and her behavior behind the scenes often shocked even the hardened Tonight Show staff. When Carson brought in multiple guests on the same night, Davis created instant friction. She had no patience for sharing the spotlight. Crew members remember moments when she would literally pivot her body, turning her back to other guests, especially younger women, in order to dominate the conversation. If another guest got the laugh, you'd see her jaw tighten, recalled a former coordinator. You could almost feel her plotting how to seize the moment back, even when she wasn't on air. Her presence was combative. Davis reportedly insisted whiskey be stocked in her dressing room before every taping. Not unusual for stars back then, but her drinking sometimes spilled into her behavior. Inappropriate remarks, slurred conversations, and sharp words aimed at the staff. One makeup artist remembered a brutal encounter. Davis rejected her services, sneering, "Find me someone whose hands don't tremble like they've had 3 days on gin." It cut deep, and the artist refused to work her shows after that. Carson usually dodged conflict. He believed in ease, in staying calm under pressure. But with Davis, even he had his limits. During one rehearsal, when Davis lashed into a cue card operator for moving too slowly, Carson quietly approached her. "Miss Davis," he said softly, "on this stage, we treat everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." Witnesses said she froze, stunned that someone had pushed back. For once, she backed down. But after her 1980s appearance, Carson privately told his team, "That's the last time. Life's too short for verbal whippings, even from an actress with 2 Oscars." What rattled Carson most about Davis wasn't just her cruelty, it was the contradiction. He truly admired her work. She was a legend, a pioneer for actresses, a powerhouse of cinema, but her genius did not outweigh the storm she carried off-screen. And if Davis represented verbally destructive energy, the next guest to scar Carson's blacklist carried a far more uncomfortable problem: behavior toward women that crossed far beyond professional boundaries. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood's crown jewel, the #1 box office star in the late 1930s and early 40s, beloved for his youthful energy and connection to stars like Judy Garland. To Tonight Show viewers, his appearances should have been celebrations, a chance to hear wild tales from the golden era of cinema. But behind the cameras, it became anything but celebratory. Carson and his crew quickly learned that Rooney's energy wasn't charming in midlife. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and occasionally out of control. His one-liners were erratic, his stories meandering. And worse, multiple staff members began whispering the same warning whenever Rooney was booked: keep the young assistants away. By the 1970s, Rooney was in his 50s. Staffers recall his interactions with young women as deeply inappropriate. He would hold onto their hands too long when they passed him water, pulling them closer, asking personal questions. "Are you married? Do you have a boyfriend?" while his grip lingered on their wrists. Some assistants began requesting reassignment if they heard Rooney was appearing. One woman later said, "It wasn't violent, but it was uncomfortable every single second, like dealing with an uncle who never learned boundaries." Carson, hearing repeated complaints, grew angrier. After a particularly chaotic night in the mid-70s, he turned to his producer and hissed, "He thinks being short gives him license to grab anyone he wants." For Johnny, This crossed an invisible line. Mistreating his staff was bad enough, but leaving them feeling unsafe? That was unforgivable. Rooney's problems didn't stop there. Alcohol appeared to follow him into the studio. Tonight Show employees recall at least 3 separate visits where Rooney stumbled through segments, his words slurred, his anecdotes wandering off into confusion. One infamous taping in 1977 left Carson fuming. Rooney began sharing a story about Judy Garland, his longtime co-star, that veered into such inappropriate territory. Carson was forced to cut him off mid-sentence. He swiftly pivoted into a new question, covering with his signature calm. But during the commercial break, Carson turned to his producer and asked, "Is he drunk, or is this just who he is now?" What frustrated Carson most about Rooney was the generational clash. Born in 1920, Rooney came from a Hollywood where certain behaviors were tolerated, sometimes even encouraged. But by the 1970s, times had changed. What others once dismissed as eccentricity, Carson saw as plain misconduct. He resented how the industry still gave Rooney a free pass, hiding him behind the legacy of his child star fame. And that resentment put Rooney squarely near the top of Johnny's mental blacklist. Crawford, cold as stone. Sinatra, the charming bully. Welles, the genius without restraint. Bette Davis, the verbal executioner. And Mickey Rooney, the chaotic has-been, who didn't know his limits. Together they painted a picture of Hollywood's dark underbelly. Stars who dazzled audiences while terrorizing crews, humiliating assistants, and crossing lines they thought fame protected them from. Johnny Carson never broadcast this list. He played the gracious host until the day he retired. But when the lights dimmed, he remembered, and slowly his mental blacklist became one of the great whispered secrets of American entertainment history. In the end, Carson wasn't just America's host. He was also its witness. And what he saw behind the cameras was often far darker than the audience ever knew. Thanks for watching this episode of Johnny Carson's Secret Blacklist. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden stories, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because in our next part, we'll dive even deeper into the guests who clashed with Johnny Carson and the truths Hollywood tried to bury.